8 years, 8 long years since that night, and not a single one of my trucker buddies believes me. Hell, I wouldn't believe me either if someone told me this story, but I'm telling it anyway because what happened out there in the Olympic Peninsula changed everything I thought I knew about what's lurking in the deep woods of Washington State. My name's Devin McCready, been hauling freight for over 15 years now. I've driven through every state, seen all kinds of weird stuff on the road, drunk drivers, police chases, even a meteor shower that lit up the sky like the 4th of July. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I encountered that October night in 2016. It was a Tuesday when my dispatcher, Rick, called me into his office. Rick's one of those guys who's been in the trucking business since CB radios were cutting-edge technology. Gruff voice, perpetual 5 o'clock shadow, and connections that run deeper than anyone wants to ask about. Rick had a special run for me. Off the books. I'd done off-the-books runs before. Usually it's just avoiding certain way stations or taking routes that bypass particular checkpoints where the DOT gets a little too curious about manifests. Nothing majorly illegal, just creative paperwork. This job was different. Old-growth timber from the Hoh River area in the Olympic Peninsula. Protected land. Harvesting old-growth timber. There wasn't just illegal, it was federal crime territory. The client was paying triple rate, cash, one night's work, 40 grand in my pocket, $40,000. That was more than I made in 6 months of legitimate hauling. My truck payments were behind, my ex-wife was threatening to take me back to court for more alimony, and my daughter's college fund was looking pretty bare. The timber was already cut and loaded at an old logging camp about 30 miles northeast of Forks. My job was simple transport. Pick up the load, deliver it to a mill outside Tacoma before sunrise. In and out, clean and quiet. I should have walked away, should have told Rick to find another driver for his shady deal. But 40 grand was 40 grand, and I convinced myself it was just one night, one run, and nobody would get hurt. Rick handed me half the payment up front in cash and detailed directions to the pickup location. The rest would come when I delivered. The plan was straightforward. Leave Seattle at 11 p.m., drive to the pickup location, load the timber, and get to Tacoma before dawn. The route would take me through some of the most remote areas of the Olympic Peninsula, but my rig, a 2014 Peterbilt 379 that had never let me down, could handle it. I'd driven that truck over 800,000 miles without a single major breakdown. She was reliable as sunrise, with a Detroit diesel engine that purred like a contented cat, and brakes that could stop on a dime. If I was going to do something this risky, at least I was doing it in a truck I trusted completely. The drive started normal enough. I-5 south to Olympia, then west on Highway 101 toward the coast. Traffic was light, just a few late-night commuters and the occasional state trooper. I kept my speed exactly at the limit, CB radio quiet, trying to look like just another trucker making an overnight haul. But as I turned off 101 onto the smaller roads that would take me deeper into the peninsula, the landscape began to change. The suburbs and small towns gave way to dense forest that pressed in on both sides of the road. Ancient Douglas firs and western red cedars towered overhead, their branches forming a canopy so thick that my headlights seemed to barely penetrate the darkness between the trees. The GPS on my dashboard started acting weird around midnight. The signal kept cutting in and out, and twice it tried to route me down roads that didn't exist. I had to rely on the handwritten directions Rick had given me, following a series of increasingly narrow and winding roads that seemed to lead deeper and deeper into the wilderness. By 1 a.m., I hadn't seen another vehicle for over an hour. The road had deteriorated from smooth asphalt to cracked pavement to what was essentially a logging road with delusions of grandeur. My truck was bouncing and swaying as the suspension worked overtime to keep the cab level. The trees here were massive, some of them easily 200 feet tall and probably older than the United States itself. This was old-growth forest, the kind that environmental groups fought wars to protect. And somewhere up ahead, I was supposed to pick up a load of it that had been illegally harvested. My conscience was starting to gnaw at me when I felt the first bump. It was 1:47 a.m. when I hit whatever was lying in the road. I remember the exact time because I was checking my watch, calculating whether I'd make the pickup on schedule. The impact wasn't massive, Felt like running over a decent-sized branch or maybe a small rock. But in trucking, it's the little things that can ruin your whole day. Within 5 minutes, I could feel the steering getting sluggish. The truck was pulling to the right, and I could hear that telltale thumping sound that every trucker dreads, a flat tire. I pulled over to the side of the road and set the parking brake. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed down from the cab to assess the damage. Sure enough, the front passenger tire was completely shredded. Whatever I'd hit had torn a gash in the sidewall that no amount of Fix-A-Flat was going to solve. That's when I made the rookie mistake that would turn a simple tire change into the worst night of my life. I hadn't checked my spare tires before leaving Seattle. When I opened the compartment where the spare should have been, I found nothing but some old rags and a tool I couldn't identify. I stood there in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by forest so dense it felt like being at the bottom of a well, with a disabled truck and no way to fix it. My cell phone showed no bars, not even emergency service. The CB radio couldn't raise anyone either. I was completely, utterly stranded. I spent the better part of an hour trying to come up with alternatives. Maybe I could drive on the rim. No, that would destroy the wheel and probably the axle. Flag down a passing vehicle? In the 3 hours I'd been on these back roads, I hadn't seen a single other car. That's when I noticed something in the forest. Deep in the trees, maybe a quarter mile off the road, I caught a glimpse of what looked like a structure. Just the edge of a roof visible through the canopy, but it was clearly man-made. A house, or maybe a cabin. People meant tools, maybe even a spare tire, or at least a phone that worked. I grabbed my flashlight and started making my way through the underbrush. The forest was thick, full of fallen logs and tangles of ferns that caught at my boots. But the promise of help kept me moving forward. It took me 20 minutes to reach what I'd spotted, and what I found wasn't what I expected. There were 3 buildings arranged in a rough semicircle around a central clearing. They looked like old logging cabins, the kind built back when timber companies established temporary camps deep in the forest. But these hadn't been temporary, they were substantial structures built to last. What was immediately obvious was that they were completely abandoned. No lights in the windows, no smoke from chimneys, no signs of recent habitation. The buildings had a weathered, forgotten look that suggested they'd been empty for years. I called out, asking if anyone was there, and explaining that I had truck trouble and could use some help. No answer, just the sound of wind in the trees and the distant hoot of an owl. I approached the largest cabin, my boots crunching on the fallen leaves that carpeted the clearing. The front door was standing ajar, creaking slightly in the breeze. When I shined my flashlight inside, I could see the interior was sparse but functional. A stone fireplace, some rough-hewn furniture, shelves that had once been lined with supplies. I called out again, stepping inside and apologizing for the intrusion while explaining my situation. Still no response. My flashlight beam revealed that while the cabin was abandoned, it hadn't been empty for as long as I'd initially thought. There were signs of relatively recent occupation, canned goods on the shelves, tools scattered about, and furniture that wasn't completely covered in dust. I started looking around for anything that might help. Tools, a phone, maybe even a tire that might fit my truck. The cabin was bigger than it looked from outside, with several rooms connected by narrow hallways. In what appeared to be a workshop, I found an impressive collection of hand tools, some spare parts for machinery I couldn't identify, and several items that made me increasingly uncomfortable about who might live here. There were chains, heavy ones with locks, animal traps of various sizes, including some that looked big enough to catch something much larger than a deer. And mounted on the walls were photographs, dozens of them, showing the forest from various angles, with dates written on the back going back several years. But it was the most recent photos that made my blood run cold. They showed footprints, massive footprints, easily twice the size of my own boot, pressed deep into the mud near a stream. The photos were dated just 3 days ago. I was studying the photographs when I heard the first sound. It started as a low rumble, almost below the range of human hearing. I felt it more than heard it, a vibration that seemed to come up through the floorboards and into my bones. At first I thought it might be a truck passing on the distant road, but it was too rhythmic, too organic. Then came the crack of breaking branches, somewhere outside and moving closer. I turned off my flashlight and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The clearing that had seemed empty and peaceful now felt threatening, full of shadows that might be hiding anything. The rumbling sound came again, closer this time, and I realized what it was. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, but not human. Whatever was making them was big, bigger than any animal I knew of that lived in these forests. I backed away from the window, my heart starting to pound. This was probably just a bear, I told myself. Black bears were common in the Olympics, and they could get pretty large. The footprints in the photos were probably just bear tracks that looked bigger in the mud. But bears don't sound like that when they walk. And bears don't typically approach buildings where humans have been living. The footsteps circled the cabin, slow and methodical. Through the thin walls, I could hear whatever it was breathing, deep, measured breaths that sounded disturbingly human-like. At one point, it paused directly outside the window where I'd been looking, and I heard a new sound, sniffing. Like a bloodhound tracking a scent, but much deeper and more resonant. I held my breath, trying to make myself as small and quiet as possible. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away, heading toward the other buildings in the clearing. That's when I should have run, should have bolted for the door and sprinted back toward my truck, flat tire or no flat tire. But curiosity and disbelief kept me frozen in place. I had to see what was out there. Moving as quietly as I could, I crept back to the window and peered out. The clearing was bathed in moonlight, and what I saw there will haunt me for the rest of my life. It stood nearly 9 feet tall, covered in dark hair that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. The body was massively built, not fat but powerfully muscled like a heavyweight boxer scaled up to impossible proportions. The arms hung nearly to its knees, ending in hands that looked capable of crushing a man's skull without effort. But it was the face that nearly made me pass out from shock. It wasn't quite human, and wasn't quite ape. The features were heavy and primitive, with a pronounced brow ridge and a jaw that projected forward like a muzzle. But the eyes, God, the eyes were intelligent, alert. They swept the clearing methodically, taking in every detail. This wasn't some bear or elk or any other animal I could rationalize away. This was a Sasquatch, a real, living, breathing Bigfoot, standing not 50 feet from where I was hiding. It moved with purpose, heading toward the second cabin. I watched as it approached the building and began examining it, running those massive hands along the walls like it was searching for something. When it reached the door, it stopped and tilted its head, listening. Then it looked directly at the cabin where I was hiding. Our eyes met through the window, and I felt something primal and terrifying pass between us. Recognition. It knew I was there, had probably known since it first approached the clearing. Those intelligent eyes studied me for a long moment, and I had the distinct impression that it was deciding what to do about me. The decision was apparently to investigate further. The creature began walking toward my cabin with purposeful strides, and I knew I had seconds before it reached the door. The back of the cabin opened onto the forest, and I made a split-second decision that probably saved my life. I ran. I crashed through the back door and into the darkness, my flashlight beam swinging wildly as I stumbled over fallen logs and crashed through underbrush. Behind me, I could hear the front door of the cabin being torn apart. Not opened, torn apart, with a splintering crash that echoed through the forest. Then came the roar. It was like nothing I'd ever heard, part human scream, part animal bellow, and completely terrifying. It was the sound of something big, powerful, and very, very angry. The chase was on, running through dense forest at night while being pursued by a creature that knows the terrain better than you do is not something I'd recommend. Every step was a gamble, a root that could trip you, a low branch that could knock you unconscious, a ravine that could break your neck. But the alternative was letting that thing catch me, and based on the sounds it was making as it crashed through the forest behind me, I didn't want to find out what would happen then. My flashlight died after about 10 minutes, leaving me stumbling through the darkness guided only by moonlight filtering through the canopy. The creature behind me didn't seem to have any trouble navigating. I could hear it gaining ground, its footsteps shaking the earth and its breathing growing closer. I tried to be smart about my route. staying on game trails when I could find them and heading generally downhill toward where I hoped the road might be. But the Olympic Peninsula Forest is a maze of ravines, fallen trees, and dense undergrowth that can turn a straight line into a zigzag nightmare. At one point, I thought I'd lost it. I'd been running for maybe an hour, and the sounds of pursuit had faded. I stopped to catch my breath behind a massive fallen cedar, my lungs burning and my legs shaking with exhaustion. That's when I heard the sniffing again, much closer than I expected. The creature had been tracking me by scent, following my trail through the forest as easily as I might follow a marked path. I could hear it moving methodically through the underbrush, pausing occasionally to test the air. I forced myself to start moving again, but my energy was running low. I'd been running for hours, and the adrenaline that had kept me going was starting to fade. My legs felt like rubber, and I was making more noise than I wanted to as I stumbled through the darkness. The creature seemed to sense my weakness. Its pursuit became more aggressive, the crashing sounds getting closer and more frequent. At one point, I could feel the vibration of its footsteps through the ground as I ran. I was starting to panic, making poor decisions and wasting energy on routes that led nowhere. When I found myself at the edge of a steep ravine with no way across, I thought it was over. I could hear the creature approaching through the trees behind me, maybe 30 seconds away. That's when I saw the lights. Far below me, at the bottom of the ravine, I could see the faint glow of headlights on asphalt. A road, not the logging road where I'd left my truck, but some other route that cut through the forest. I didn't have time to look for a safe way down. I could hear branches breaking as the creature closed in, so I half jumped, half fell down the steep slope, grabbing at trees and rocks to slow my descent. I hit the road hard, rolling and skinning my knees on the asphalt. But I was alive, and more importantly, I was on a surface where a human could outrun something that weighed 800 pounds. I picked myself up and started running down the center line, hoping against hope that a car would come by. The road was narrow and winding, cutting through the forest like a scar, but it was level and clear. Behind me, I could hear the creature crashing down the slope I'd just descended. It was having more trouble than I had. Something that big doesn't navigate steep terrain as easily as a desperate human. I'd been running down the road for maybe 10 minutes when I saw the headlights approaching from ahead. A single car moving fast through the curves. I stepped into the middle of the road and started waving my arms, probably looking like a complete lunatic. The car was moving faster than whoever was driving realized. When the headlights illuminated me, I heard the screech of brakes and the squeal of tires as the driver swerved hard to avoid hitting me. That's when everything went wrong in a way I never could have anticipated. The car, a late model Honda Civic, swerved to miss me and went off the road to the right, clipping a tree and spinning back toward the center of the asphalt. The driver overcorrected and the car skidded sideways across both lanes before slamming into a massive Douglas fir on the left side of the road. The impact was tremendous. The tree was easily 6 feet in diameter and the car hit it at probably 40 miles per hour. The front end crumpled like an accordion and steam started pouring from under the hood. I ran toward the wreck, ready to help the driver, when I heard something that made me freeze in place. The creature's roar, much closer than I expected. It had reached the road and was charging toward us, drawn by the noise of the crash. In the glow of the car's headlights, I could see it clearly for the first time, all 9 feet of it, covered in dark brown hair and moving with a speed that seemed impossible for something that size. The creature was focused on the car, perhaps seeing it as a threat or simply investigating the source of the commotion. It approached the wreck at full speed, and what happened next was like something out of a horror movie. The Honda had come to rest with its passenger side against the tree, and the creature apparently didn't see the obstacle. It hit the car at full speed, its momentum carrying it forward into the tree with a sickening crunch that I felt in my bones. The impact was so violent that it shook leaves from the branches overhead. The creature's massive body was pinned between the car and the tree, and after a moment of thrashing, it went completely still. I stood there in the middle of the road, hardly able to believe what I'd just witnessed. The creature that had been chasing me for hours was apparently dead, killed by its own momentum when it crashed into the accident it had indirectly caused. But my relief was short-lived. I could hear moaning from inside the car. The driver was alive but hurt. I ran to the car and peered through the spiderwebbed windshield. The driver was a young woman, maybe in her 20s, slumped over the steering wheel with blood trickling from a cut on her forehead. She was unconscious but breathing, and I couldn't see any obvious life-threatening injuries. The car door was jammed, but I managed to force it open and check her vitals. She had a pulse, and her breathing seemed steady. The blood was from a superficial cut where she'd hit the steering wheel, and while she probably had a concussion, she didn't seem to be in immediate danger. The creature, on the other hand, was clearly dead. Its massive body was wedged between the car and the tree, and its neck was bent at an angle that left no doubt about its condition. In death, it looked even more imposing than it had in life. Easily 800 pounds of muscle and bone that had been moving through the forest with predatory grace just minutes before. I should have stayed with the injured driver, but panic was setting in. I needed help, medical assistance for the woman, and frankly, I had no idea how to explain what had just happened. Who was going to believe that a Bigfoot had chased me through the forest and accidentally killed itself in a car crash? I started running down the road again, leaving the accident scene behind. After about an hour of walking and jogging, I saw lights ahead. Not headlights, but the steady glow of a small town. Clearwater was barely worthy of the name town. Maybe 200 people, a general store, a diner, and a tiny sheriff's office that probably handled more noise complaints than actual crimes. But it had a phone, and more importantly, it had people who could help. I burst into the sheriff's office at 4:30 a.m., probably looking like I'd been mauled by a bear, which wasn't far from the truth. I explained to the deputy on duty, a young guy who looked like he'd been dozing at his desk, that there had been an accident about 10 miles north on Forest Road 47. A woman was hurt, and there was something else he needed to see. The deputy took down the basic information and called for an ambulance. Within 15 minutes, we had a small convoy heading back toward the crash site, an ambulance, a fire truck, and the deputy's patrol car with me riding shotgun. But we never made it to the accident. About 5 miles from town, we encountered a roadblock that hadn't been there when I'd passed through earlier. 2 black SUVs were parked across the road, and several men in dark suits were directing traffic away from the area. The lead agent informed Deputy Morrison that there was a federal investigation in progress and the road was closed until further notice. When Morrison protested that he had an injured motorist up there and needed to get medical assistance through, the man replied that the situation was being handled and ordered us to turn around and return to town. Morrison looked like he wanted to argue, but something about these guys suggested they weren't local Forest Service or even FBI. They had an authority that went deeper than badges, and the equipment they were using looked military grade. When I asked what kind of federal investigation was happening, the man looked at me for the first time, and I had the distinct impression that he already knew who I was and why I was there. He simply stated that it was classified and repeated his order for us to turn around. We had no choice but to return to town. The ambulance and fire truck were turned back as well, and Morrison spent the next hour on the radio trying to find out who had authority over whatever was happening on Forest Road 47. He never got a straight answer. By sunrise, I was sitting in the diner in Clearwater, drinking coffee that tasted like it had been made with motor oil and trying to process what had happened. Morrison sat across from me, his incident report half finished, asking me to clarify my story. I'd been trying to figure out how to answer his questions for hours. The truth sounded insane, but I couldn't think of a lie that would explain everything that had happened. I told him I thought it was a bear, a really big bear that got aggressive when I disturbed its territory. Morrison nodded like that made sense, which it sort of did if you ignored the details. When he asked about the bear being hit by a car that crashed into a tree, I confirmed that was roughly what happened. Morrison finished writing his report, but I could tell he wasn't entirely satisfied with my story. There were too many gaps, too many details that didn't quite add up. He mentioned that the federal agents would probably want to talk to me since whatever they were investigating up there might be related to my accident. But the federal agents never came to talk to me. In fact, as the morning wore on, it became clear that they had no interest in my story at all. A tow truck was allowed through the roadblock to retrieve my disabled truck. Apparently my flat tire had been repaired, and the truck moved to a service station in Forks. By noon, I was back on the road, heading toward Tacoma with no cargo and a story I couldn't tell anyone. I never did deliver that load of illegal timber. When I called Rick to explain what had happened, he was surprisingly unconcerned about the loss of the cargo. He simply said that sometimes jobs go sideways and there was nothing I could have done about it. But when I pressed him for details about who had arranged the shipment and where the timber had come from, he became evasive. He advised me not to ask too many questions about that particular job, mentioning that some clients prefer to keep things quiet. I started to suspect that the whole timber operation had been a setup, that someone had wanted me in those woods at that particular time for reasons I couldn't understand. But why? And who? I tried to research the area where everything had happened, looking for information about the abandoned cabins and the logging operations that might have operated there. What I found was frustrating. The land had been owned by a series of shell companies and government entities, with ownership changing hands frequently over the past several decades. The cabins themselves didn't appear on any official maps or property records. As far as the government was concerned, they didn't exist. The incident with the injured driver also disappeared from official records. When I called the State Patrol to check on her condition, they had no record of any accident on Forest Road 47 that night. According to them, nothing had happened. But I knew what I'd seen. The woman had been real, the crash had been real, and the creature, God help me, had been real too. 8 years later, I'm still driving truck, still hauling legitimate cargo on routes that keep me far away from the Olympic Peninsula. I've told this story to a few people, close friends, family members, other truckers who've shared their own strange experiences from the road. Nobody believes me. They listen politely, nod in the right places, and then change the subject. A few have suggested I might have hallucinated the whole thing. Too much stress, too little sleep, maybe some kind of gas leak in the cab that affected my perception. But I know what I experienced that night. I know what chased me through those woods, and I know what died in that crash. I also know that some very powerful people went to a lot of trouble to make sure the incident never became public knowledge. The question that keeps me awake at night isn't whether Sasquatch exists. I know it does. The question is why the government is so determined to keep it secret, and how many other people have had encounters that have been covered up or discredited. I've done some research over the years looking into other Bigfoot sightings in the Pacific Northwest. What I've found is a pattern: credible witnesses whose stories are dismissed, physical evidence that disappears, and government agencies that claim to have no knowledge of anything unusual. But every now and then, I find someone whose story matches mine, someone who encountered something impossible and found themselves up against forces more powerful than they could understand. We're out here, the people who've seen the truth. We know what's hiding in the deep woods, and we know that someone or some organization is working very hard to make sure the rest of the world never finds out. I still drive the highways and back roads of America, hauling cargo from coast to coast. But I'm more careful now about which jobs I take and which routes I travel. I avoid the deep forest whenever possible, especially at night, and I never ever take off the books jobs from clients I don't know. Sometimes when I'm driving through remote areas, I'll catch a glimpse of something moving in the tree line. Just a shadow, just a suggestion of something large and bipedal. But I don't stop to investigate, and I don't slow down. I keep my spare tires properly maintained, my cell phone charged, and my CB radio tuned to the emergency channel. And when other truckers share stories about strange encounters on remote highways, I listen without judgment. Because I know the truth that most people aren't ready to accept. We're not alone out here. There are things living in the wild places of America that science hasn't cataloged and the government doesn't want us to know about. I saw one of them die that night on Forest Road 47, pinned between a Honda Civic and a Douglas fir tree. But I also know there are others out there, moving through the forests and mountains, staying just out of sight of the human world that has encroached on their territory. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving through country so remote that my headlights are the only illumination for miles, I wonder if one of them is watching me pass, remembering the human who witnessed their secret and lived to tell about it. The road goes on, and so do the mysteries it holds. But I'll keep driving, keep hauling, and keep watching for signs of things that officially don't exist. Because 8 years ago, I learned that the world is bigger and stranger than most people imagine. And once you've seen the impossible, you can never quite look at the empty spaces on the map the same way again. That's my story. Believe it or don't, I've learned not to care what people think. But if you're ever driving through the deep woods of the Pacific Northwest and you see something that shouldn't exist, remember what I've told you. And whatever you do, don't stop to investigate. Just keep driving and hope it doesn't decide to follow you home. If you're interested in more stories like this, check this one out.